All right, we'll start our second session. In this session, I think we better have question and answer. If you guys have questions from the presentation, we will respond to those questions, and we can make discussions. I mean, even suggestions will be okay. So that way we will finalize in 25 minutes. Any question from the presentation?
I do.
Okay.
Amy, I guess my question is, these promises, so to speak, right? Have you, in your expertise, and you've been around in our communities for long, has the Ethiopian government ever promised this lengthy of article of protection, so to speak?
You know, thinking back to there have only been 3 UPRs for the government of Ethiopia, so 2014, and then prior to that, that would have been 2009. And I think this is really unprecedented, the level of commitment and the level of seriousness. Of course, we saw in 2014 the government promising to do things that it didn't do as well. So it's a matter of not only how many promises does the government make, but what commitment is there to move forward on those promises. And so that's why I think it's particularly fortuitous timing of the Nobel Peace Prize, because that also, the committee's statement in awarding the prize emphasized that this is a time when the Prime Minister's efforts deserve recognition and encouragement. So he needs encouragement to do more and not just make empty promises, not just have hollow promises to make sure that they're implemented. But it's really far more than the previous administrations have done in the UPR.
Maybe to a little bit explain, those recommendations are from 132 countries. The thing is, before the recommendations happened, there was lobbying efforts. The advocates have been sending the reports to delegates of different countries. So on a review day, May 14, 2019, those countries who had a report have been recommending these things, these phrases to Ethiopia, based on depending on areas which they are more touched or areas where they're more interested, they were giving recommendations. Those are recommendations. How many recommendations total?
327. Yes,
327 recommendations by 132 countries. So, and those are marked by yellow or accepted by Ethiopian government. Those marked by yellow. So just to say that. Any other question? Oh, yeah.
Can I have
it's over there. Oh, it's on that table. Yeah, it's on that table.
I want to say something on the recommendation and whatever. I don't know.
Thank you.
Yeah, so what we should talk among ourselves, but since you are here, maybe it's better to hear. It's for the people of we have a community center, and we are people who are elected to serve the community, not to be served. And we have Oromos in, I think, all over the world. And those of us and those who are closely working with the human rights, I think we have to establish the group that work with you, not only 1 or 2. We need a couple of people who will work. What do I mean by work? We have to organize a community to teach the people who are out here in Australia, in Europe, anywhere, everywhere. We have to have connection. We have to have people who are constantly, day and night, work with them. Not only people who are outside the country, and also inside the country, in Ethiopia. Day and night, the connection should cut off. And unless you organize and arise the people to the right of themselves and to the right of the country, and to push the government. The government has no power. The power is in people's hand. But it's good to know the responsibility of the government and individual and other group, other community. And we have to teach people. And things will not happen over the night. We start on one step. And what is my responsibility? What is as an individual, as a collective, and what I expect from my leader? And this majority of us don't know, and we have to teach them. We have to teach the younger one, we have to teach the older one, the middle ages. Each and everyone has to stand together and move together. Then we can do great things.
Yep.
And you have to hear, but this should be done among ourselves. And since you are working with anybody, locally, internationally, you should know what is expected from the community, and
yep, vice versa. Thank you very much, Kadir Wade. Actually, we have a group of people who have been working with the advocates. It's called United Oromo Voices. We may not have made a good outreach to everybody, but that group have been helping on interviewing for reports that should go for universal periodic review. A couple of you, I remember, and a couple of you were in a meeting that have been organized by United Oromo Voices. The title of the meeting was Minnesota Closer to Ethiopia? Closer to Ethiopia. In a Blue House in Norway House on a Franklin and 1112, something like that. Yeah, Closer to Ethiopia, I think something with that title. We had a meeting, and then after that, that group have been working. There can be, might need outreach and include people and strengthen that group to still do things, or the same way. Other groups people can form other groups and work with the advocates, but I'll give to Amy to comment more on this point.
Yeah, I think there's so much work to be done. It's not just one organization that can do it all. And so it'd be great to collaborate with the Oromo community of Minnesota, but with, not only with Oromos, but with other people who are concerned about human rights in Ethiopia, because there is so much that needs to be done. And when I think about this long list of recommendations, 270 recommendations that need to be implemented in the next 5 years, that's a ton of work for the government and for civil society. And what I envision, if the community wants the advocates to help do some training, do some introductions, and collaborate, we're open to that, to collaborating with any group or individuals who want to collaborate with us. Oromo community of Minnesota, the United Oromo Voices was really helpful in helping get volunteers to do interviews with us so we could get those facts to the UN. But another thing you might consider doing, since you have 270 recommendations, they're on different topics. Mm-hmm. So maybe you have one task force that just looks at the elections. And they're going to look at all the recommendations about the elections and what needs to be done and figure out a strategy. Between now and May of 2020, here's what needs to be done, and working with people on the ground in Ethiopia and working with the government to make sure that the government keeps its promises for the 2020 elections. That could be one group. Another group could focus on violence against women and those issues, and figure out what needs to be done, what role the advocates could play, and reach out to the contacts in the government, because now the government should be more receptive to hearing from the people. And to say, look, you promised to do this law, here's an organization in Minnesota that can help you write the law, that can help you keep your promises about a comprehensive law on violence against women. So there could be different groups that do focus on different issues, but to try to cover all 270 recommendations to make sure that the government is making as much progress as it possibly can between now and 2024. So I think it's great to get the community organized and to figure out what people can do to help push the government to keep its promises and not just make them empty promises.
Okay, Bahar.
Thank you, advocate, for the wonderful job. The change the human rights that happened in Ethiopia due to your persistent advocacy and other works. So you're very thankful. We are very grateful to you for what you are doing. So coming to the report, I think on the accountability we have to be fair that not only accept the government the accountability and other recommendation. I think we have to be on record that there were significant accountability that have undertaken. The entire leadership of the national intelligence and security are behind bars now, facing trial. People who are accused for abusing the human rights in the prisons are under arrest, facing trial. Also, the trial is somewhat not fair or not speedy as it should be. But I think we have to keep that there is some ground going on regarding that country. But now there is new dynamics that's going in Ethiopia. What is that is now when you try to arrest an individual, that individual will run to his ethnic group or his region, and now we have now like a sanctuary state where they base there, and anything that happens, that person is interpreted as attack on his ethnic or his regional states. To take the notorious example, the chief of the National Intelligence Agency, who is pending, his case is pending in court, is at large, practically now in Makale. So nobody is going after him. So it's difficult to enforce law and let the military sit there and start a civil war in the country. So this kind of accountability issue is going on now, and the people are, when there are business elites now who are implicated in corruption, then they go to some ethnic group, in their group, and then they invest, then they become a hero, and if you go after them, it's like going after the people. So how do you going to challenge this kind of new normal dynamics going on here?
Well, I don't have the specific answers because I'm not on the ground, and while I understand some of the ethnic dimensions, I'm not an expert in that. But what I would suggest is that accountability means accountability for all human rights violators. And yes, it's true that ethnic groups may provide sanctuary, may hide people who are responsible for horrible human rights violations, but that can't happen forever. We know it's just not possible. And the government of Ethiopia is the unified government of the whole country, and to the extent that there's an ethnic group in a particular region of the country that is trying to avoid the rule of law, that can happen on a temporary basis, but that can't happen on a permanent basis, because there needs to be not only accountability for the individual human rights violators, but there has to be accountability for complying with the law. And one of the sets of recommendations I thought was really encouraging is recommendations to support the independence of the judiciary, making the courts more independent and not a tool of political parties. And if the courts are independent, then the courts in that region, if the judges in that region feel like they are independent and they need to be neutral interpreters of the law, then they need to make sure that the police arrest that person and bring them to court. If the person has been charged with a crime, they need to appear in court. So I think there are maybe some potential solutions in the recommendations, but I think it also has to do with strengthening accountability within the government structures, that people feel like they don't have to answer to the ethnic group that is wanting to protect someone, they answer to what the law says. And that's really the whole purpose of rule of law, is that the law is what makes the determination and not the individual ethnic politics and all of that. So I don't have an easy solution, but I think that's one thing to think about, is how to strengthen the government structures to make sure that they're following human rights, of course, but also making sure that people do follow the law. And you can't use escaping to a particular region as a way to escape the law, because the law should apply all over the country.
Amy, does the UN have a special rapporteur for Ethiopia that is going to do the truth and reconciliation? part of this, or are we too far out in advance of that?
I mean, there isn't right now a special rapporteur specific to Ethiopia, but there are special rapporteurs who could do another thing that there were recommendations on is having country visits by some of the special procedures at the United Nations, and there are special procedures related to accountability for torture. For example, there's a special rapporteur on torture, and the government of Ethiopia could invite him to come to Ethiopia to do a visit, to meet with victims of torture, to meet with stakeholders, to meet with the prison officials, etc., and to make recommendations about what should be done going forward. So that might be another way to put pressure on the government to make sure that people aren't providing sort of safe harbor to human rights violators.
Let me just tell you a little bit about what I know about Bosnia. You know, they had a genocide there in the 1980s. Okay, so now it is literally 20 plus years later. They were eventually able, with the United Nations mechanism, to put at least 30 of all the top leadership, the perpetrators, are sentenced to pretty much life sentences through in The Hague, in the justice system. The other 5,000 to 8,000 war criminals who, you know, committed rape and murder of their neighbors, that is slowly moving through the Bosnian justice system, and these people will, many of them, they will die before they ever actually get to trial. So once you use the country itself, things slow down. There's economic resources are spent on other things. So you can be very successful at it, but it depends on how it's done. I think Liberia had a really some interesting and maybe not very satisfactory resolutions to how they find, you know, you have to stop the violence and keep peace, is, you know, not have any more issues. But there's many different successes and not great successes that have happened, but you just have to, 20 years later, they're still working on it for Bosnia. But they got all of the leadership right away. So, good news.
Thank you, Judy. So to a little bit give some areas which Amy should say a few things. You already mentioned that the advocates can do the training, and there are other areas which advocates can contribute to support the Ethiopian government to implement these recommendations, right? So how about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission? And can you have a model, a country you can mention to that?
Before that, I have one question. How looks like your implementation follow-up?
How follow-up?
Yeah, how do you just measure the implementation, the magnitude of Ethiopian government's implementing? Are you going to be send some organization or some technical person, or do you have any mechanism that hook Ethiopian government? Maybe as you mentioned that because some implementation needs really economic inefficiency. So do you have some mediator between you and the government, that Ethiopian government, to do or to support them for technical implementation? And how looks like your implementation measure?
Yeah. So we don't have any financing or anything, so it would be a matter of working out, first of all, whether the government of Ethiopia wants our technical support and assistance, and then figuring out how to pay for it, to do trainings or whatever it would be. A lot of it we can do remotely. We can assist with drafting a law from our offices in Minneapolis. We don't have to go to Ethiopia to assist with drafting a law. We can communicate by email or Skype, whatever means of communication we can do electronically would work. But there are other things like trainings where you really need to have a physical presence. And so that would be a matter of figuring out what it is and then looking at which governments made the recommendations to train the police forces on human rights. Maybe they would be willing to fund police officers coming from Minnesota to train their colleagues in Ethiopia about how to respect human rights in doing their day-to-day work. So we don't have a mechanism to go on the ground and monitor whether and to what extent the government of Ethiopia is implementing the recommendations. Again, it will be a fact-finding process. So what we're able to monitor remotely through the internet, through our contacts, and then getting information, doing more interviews with people who are in Ethiopia, from people who come from Ethiopia, people who go to visit And we'll want to hear from them. What are you seeing? Has the government done this? Has the government done that? And what is the government saying? If you ask them about it, what are they saying about accountability for human rights violations in detention facilities? Have they done anything? So we're really relying on the eyes and ears of people on the ground and people who are really focused on Ethiopia to tell us what progress is being made, and by 2024, what progress has been made on implementing these recommendations. We can't do it on our own. We don't have the capacity to do that. But we know there are people out there who have that information, or who will have that information, and can get it to us. So it's really, we need to have a collaboration to make sure that that happens. But there's no sort of simple, easy solution. It's, Judy said it's like a job performance, but it's so much more complicated than a job performance because there are so many different things. After a job performance review, you kind of, you probably get maybe 5 or 10 recommendations of things to do between now and your next review. Well, now it's 270 things they have to do. So that's a lot more complicated. There are a lot more people who can pull at the different levers to make things happen or not. And a lot more people who need to sort of supervise the government to see whether it's doing its job and what should happen at the next performance review.
One other thing. I remember at my church many years ago, I said, we should address this issue. And my pastor said, that's a great idea. And he came up to me afterwards and he said, you're in charge of that. Because you're the one with the idea. You've heard of Greta Thunberg, right? She's the girl, Swedish, yes, who had 1 million students marching in just 1 year for climate change, addressing climate change. One person. So we don't have to be Greta, but you have the power to call and call again and call again, and somebody knows they have to answer you, and you could be the person who does this. That actually has been the most effective mechanism for human rights over time.
Thank you very much. Are there any more questions?
I would like just to recommend and thank you. Thank you, Natasha, for organizing everything that I have seen you every week. People come here and start discussing about our country, where we were born, and we still feel that
Part of it.
part of it, even though we are in the United States, our mind is always in Ethiopia. And starting with the small discussions, this will go to a larger, probably larger region. And when it comes to these pointers, I looked at some of these pointers 15 years ago. I know there are laws that talk about this, all these pointers. 15 years ago, I took training on human rights, civil rights, human rights, all kinds of things that is mentioned in here. But in Ethiopia, the issue is there is no application. Everything is there, all right, everything is written. It's just like things on the paper that doesn't drop any drop on the ground. So it is good to have a discussion like this, but I don't know how it can go to Ethiopia, how it can reach to Ethiopia, not just to the government. The government knows these things, but to the public who are really suffering with everything. So we will do our best, and hopefully we'll come together and maybe at a larger group, so that people from Ethiopia or all over the world will listen and carefully take their responsibility. And I'm very grateful for you guys to do what we are supposed to do as a human. It's not about where we go. It's not about our identity. It's about what human being has to do. So you guys are doing those things, and thank you so much for doing it. And I'm running out of time. There is another event that is waiting. I was invited last night to be there because there is a group of people who try to come together and on one side celebrates the Nobel Peace Prize for Dr. Abiy, and on the other side to see what is expected, to discuss what it means, and what I got from you guys is a good document that I can use it, and probably I will share with those people, and anyone who is interested, even to join. It's a lunch, and people will be there and talk and discuss and figure out what it means. You know, it's not about being a what it means. To me, giving 270 points to someone and giving him a what is like putting the person on the fire. Do it and figure out how you can put out this light. So I'm very happy to be here, and thank you so much for your wonderful information that you give us, and hopefully we'll be in contact.
Thank you, Abdulrazak, for.
I just wanted to mention one more thing that you can do as a group. Do you remember when the Liberians in Brooklyn Park, mostly, they have a large community there, were facing deportation?
Yeah.
They were going to pull their protected status, the U.S. administration, the White House. And Senator Tina Smith and Dean Phillips, who is my representative, you have Betty McCollum here in St. Paul, I don't know who you're involved with, but they lobbied so hard. And the day before this deportation was supposed to happen, they reneged on it and agreed that these people could stay for a temporary period of time. So I think using your representatives, going as a group and then following up with them to say, what are you doing? They would be very amenable to that. They want to be able to say that they've worked for human rights, and Tina Smith has used that in some of her advertising. You know, this was a big success for her. So I think that's a good route too.
Yeah, thank you very much. And to finalize, we're wrapping up. So I would like to thank Amy and Julie for being here, for doing this presentation happen. Thank you, audiences. Thank you very much for showing up. And I hope we will have another session here sometime in the future. And another announcement we have is we will have another discussion next week. We will be talking about Gada, the Oromo Gada system. So thank you very much, and thank you those who attended our Facebook Live. And thank you, we're done here.
Thank you to the Eastside Freedom Library.
Yeah, thank you for the Eastside Freedom Library.
You didn't give a date and an address for the next week you have.
Same place, same
time.
It's incomplete information.
Same place, same time.
Right here.
We didn't do that thing yet.
No, we didn't do that thing yet.
Okay.
Watch this space for more information. Probably the Eastside Freedom Library
Yeah.
Facebook page.
Yes, from the Facebook page. But most probably we'll be discussing that with Peter, and we might have, but if we have it, it's from 10.
From 8?
The same time, 10, from 10.
Okay.
10 a.m.
Right here.
Yep.
10 is when you start, not when you start journey from your home. 10 is when the session starts here.
Don't go.
Sorry.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you,
The
everyone.
perpetrators have gone and fled back to their community and are hiding.